Thanks for downloading this episode from Teachers Talk Radio. You can find the full schedule and listen back to all our shows at ttradio.org. Enjoy the podcast.
Welcome, everybody. Happy Monday from me and from everyone at TTR, and thank you very much for joining us. I'm sure you've had a busy day, so we really appreciate it. We are going to be talking tonight all things feedback, all things classroom feedback, and how teachers deliver feedback. And I'm joined by an esteemed guest, Ross McGill. Ross, how are you today?
I'm very well, Tom. Nice to catch up with you again.
Of course. Now, Ross has written a book called The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback. Now, we are going to be digging into this book in the next, at least an hour, I would have thought. And knowing me, it'll probably go on a lot longer, especially when we get into the stuff where we probably end up in a debate of some sort about something. Yeah. That'll probably come later. It's amazing actually to be able to talk about this topic. It's one that I think is still a hot topic in education. Would you agree with that? Marking and feedback?
Oh, 100%, yes.
I sort of think there's been an evolution, which we're going to obviously talk about tonight through the medium of your book, Ross, but also just in general terms, what's been happening with marking and feedback. So before we do anything, do you want to just in 10 seconds, and I'm going to time you, maybe 3 sentences, tell all the TTR listeners out there who you are in 3 sentences.
My name's Ross McGill. I've been a classroom teacher for 26 years. I started blogging as Teacher Toolkit in 2007, and 20 million people have read the website to date. I now work in schools all around the world and write books, and I love being in front of teachers talking about teaching.
That was 9 sentences, Ross.
Right. Okay.
But we will allow it.
Thank you for the feedback.
Now, you have written a book called The Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback. Now, you've written before several times on marking and feedback. Why did you decide to write this particular book? What inspired you to go for this one?
I think it's an evolution of thought. So Mark Plan Teach at the time was, that dialogue of triple marking, and when inspectors to a degree still looked in student books, and I think we were moving away from at the time across England of progress over time in books and those kind of things. But, for many years still, a lot of people still penalise, I suppose, teachers particularly, about the work scrutiny methodologies that sometimes are used. And when you talk about a 2-year-old or a maths classroom or an English classroom in a secondary school, marking and feedback can look very different. So I guess the book now for me is a culmination of lots of reading, lots of experiences outside of my own classroom, and just trying to unpick the marking burden, which I've seen across the profession for 10 plus years. It's all across my website data. Every time I'm in front of teachers in a school leading Mark Plan Teach training, when I survey them on workload anonymously in the room, marking always comes up as the number one headache for them all, regardless of school setting. So in 2019, I published a piece of research on verbal feedback. How can we evidence that when teachers talk to kids not like the books, does it make a difference to their outcomes? All teachers will say, of course it does, but there's not much evidence out there. So the book was the next step of that research journey for me to try and showcase not everything needs to be written in a book, and how do we reduce this headache and perception that it does.
Just before because I've got a few follow-on questions from that, but just before we get into that, I want to big shout out to all our watchers and listeners, of course. If you're watching this live, you can get involved by tweeting us or tagging us on any social network at TT Radio Official. And we, of course, will endeavour to post any of those questions live to Ross. And, of course, just general comments and anything you post, please, send it in and get involved in the conversation. It's not just me and Ross, it's you guys as well. So, yeah, okay. That's the motivation for writing it. I wondered, you mentioned Mark Plan Teach there, which is obviously a highly successful book. Is there anything you regret writing in Mark Plan Teach that you have since looked at and said, I wish I had not included that in the book because it's cringe?
No, I don't think so. I lived Mark Plan Teach in probably 300 or 400 schools around the world. And then I published version 2, and it was based on all my experiences of living it. So there might be a perception it's another book just for the number 2 on the front, but actually there's a good 50% of new material inside the book testing the ideas. It's a good question, because once your book works in print, that is it. You can't change it. Whereas a blog, you can delete it and edit
also
it.
with marking and feedback, things evolve.
Yeah, of course.
Quite quickly. So
yeah, no, absolutely. But when I go on my travels all over the place, whether it's to Carlisle or to Kenya, there's people and teachers in schools in other parts of the world that are light years behind what we're doing in England. So many of the ideas will still be applicable to someone at some stage. Obviously, we have a responsibility to kind of be at the forefront of our own thinking here in our own country. But, people that are listening to this show and to, follow you or I on Twitter or whatever, we'd like to think that we're trying to keep up to date with our practice. That's why we choose to talk about teaching in our free time and social media. But that's not for everybody. So, I'd like to think that most teachers are more and more sucking up that kind of CPD content material, but still not for everyone. It's hard to stay up to date with everything and anything in any field, not just in education and what topic. I was talking to some school leaders today about autism, and some of the stuff that's on my site is already out of date. So, what do you leave it there as a legacy to show you how far the dialogue has moved, or do you delete it just because it's out of date? I unless it's harmful, I don't view that anything should be deleted. It should be there as a kind of stamp in time.
Yeah, totally. Things evolve.
No regrets.
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, things evolve, don't they? So it's just natural process, really. Okay, so at the start of the book, I didn't know whether to start with this or something else, but I'll start with this. At the start of the book, first of all, you have a lovely foreword written by John Hattie. So do you want to tell us a little bit about that and what you think the key takeaways from that are before people even get into the book itself?
Well, I was lucky enough to share a keynote stage with John Hattie in 2017, just in the summer when I decided to kind of step out. And I suppose prior to that, 5-10 years or so, really getting interested in academic research. Obviously, John Hattie at the time was a massive legend. So to be able to share a stage with him on the same day and talk about teaching was just a real honor. And, he was very hospitable and friendly and all those kind of things. But after that point, we just kept in touch. And he's always replied to my emails. So it's always flattering just to share how I perceive his research. What does he think about this? And he'll ping a quick one word or a quick sentence. So that's always been flattering. And then I offered him the book idea and said, look, this is where I think I'm taking my thoughts on feedback next, based on all my experiences, things that he's written, Dylan William and whoever else. And this is what I'm doing. And he said, it sounds like a great idea and a nice step forward with the kind of dialogue on feedback. And what he likes, as we all do once you step out of the classroom, is here's some real classroom practice ideas. So I was very keen to have 9 schools inside the book as case studies, because I'm in schools all the time. So it's just nice to use what they're doing, gives the school a bit of a shout out, and they're really happy to be featured in the book. So that's always nice. But John was very flattering, and I think, for him to write it's a significant contribution to his research on feedback, that is a very flattering statement. So it's early days. As I always say to people, I don't think every school's ready for this book, because I had one academic head, in fact, a very fascinating school I went to recently called King's School in Canterbury Cathedral. My God, what an amazing environment they work in. But the academic head, after I presented the ideas to their teaching staff, he said, you've just ripped up everything I know about marketing and thrown it back into the ring. And that's a good way to sum it up. It will change your current views on marketing feedback.
Yeah. I mean, we'll come on to the sort of composition of the book, obviously, in a bit, because it is interesting the different emphasis you've put on different things in the book. And I'll come on to that a little bit later. Yeah. But in case people don't know what it looks like, there it is. That is what it looks like on a shelf, in case any of you are wondering what we're talking about right now. That's the book. So you can check it out in all good bookstores, or more preferably on the bloomsbury.com website. And we'll put a link to that later on in the show. So, okay, let's dig into the book itself. You talked about the foreword by John Hattie. Now, you start the book by talking about the introducing these 9 distinct formative assessment techniques. So I wondered whether, I don't know whether you want to start with that or whether you want to start somewhere else, but I was going to ask you whether you could briefly explain each of those techniques and their significance within this book, or whether you could just give us why you chose those 9, where those 9 arrived from. And I know you've got something you might want to show.
I've got one slide that probably best articulates for viewers, and then for people listening, I'll try my best to summarize the technique.
Yeah, no, because it is interesting. Yeah,
I just put one slide up. So I guess my evolution of thinking was that typically we've got 3 methods where we can provide that formative assessment. So obviously in these, in number 1 and 2 on the screen, you can throw in question. But for people listening, maybe not watching, what I've got on the screen is a written methodology for providing students with some feedback. That's traditionally our marking techniques in kind of number 1. We all know that we can talk to kids, so that verbal feedback is the language we might typically use. Plus, I guess something that I think is really undervalued in terms of formative assessment is the whole raft of gestures and cues and body language. You know, the times you lean in, you stare, you do a non-verbal signal across the classroom, the thumbs up, thumbs down. You know, when last were you ever given any explicit CPD on that particular pedagogy? It's just something that's left to chance. If we think about next how you quality assure these 3 types, written, verbal, or non-verbal, traditionally when we do work scrutiny in our schools, we often just go straight to the books because it's a concrete way of us checking in on what happened after we've missed it live, I suppose. Maybe one mutation of number 2, the verbal feedback, will be, well, there's a verbal feedback stamp in the book. So next time the teacher comes in and look at your book, Tom, make sure you show Miss or Sir that there's a stamp in there from me that we've spoken about your work. So you can start to see how decisions that teachers make can become belittled because of the quality assurance process gets in the way. If I give you a thumb up in class every day and it really boosts your motivation, how would I evidence that? How do I know it well, I know it makes a difference, but how do I evidence it in terms of outcomes, whether it's behavior, exam scores, or you turning up to class on time for punctuality? So that was my kind of starting point. And then by definition, feedback, when you produce a piece of work, I feedback on your journey. So that's where I can compare it to something you've done before. So you can't give me feedback on this conversation, I suppose, or the book, because you've got nothing to compare it to. It's only if I produce it again in Mark Plan Teach 2, you could compare the differences. So there's a kind of 4th possibility in terms of formative assessment. Now, these 2 words, feed up and feed forward, I've discovered they've been around academically for about 30 odd years in written papers. I came across them for the first time about 7 or 8 years ago when I had a bit more time on my travels, researching, reading, those kind of things. And I thought, well, these are interesting. Let me play around with these in my training sessions. So whenever I delivered the marking aspect of Mark Plan Teach, I would always present these 3 techniques, feedback, feed up, feed forward, just to kind of a bit of a litmus test for teachers to gauge their understanding. And what I found was the vast majority had never heard of 5 or 6. Despite teachers doing 5 and 6 all the time. So number 5, the feed up for people listening, is if you give me a piece of work, I would give you that grade assessment. That's a grade 5, but your target's a grade 9. and I might want to add one or two other things, written or verbally, but that's what feed up means.
But can I just, Ross, I'll be honest with you, I had to read that about 17 times to really understand that feed up bit, like what you're trying to get with there. And one of my immediate questions was, what if the target grades themselves aren't valid, if that makes sense? So does that...
Right. Well, of course, with any assessment, we can get into those kind of questions. Yeah. Maybe if you make a note, well, let's talk about that in greater detail later. It's a good question. As with all data, we need to be able to trust it and understand if it's reliable or not.
Yeah.
And what to do with the data once we've got it. So I guess when those things are in place and we can trust the data, I guess your feed up can be reliable, just as if feed back or feed forward. Feed forward, for definition, teachers again do this all the time. That's a great piece of work. I might say the grade if I want to, but here's what to do next to get to the next grade, the next stage. Yeah. So teachers are always explaining to students what to do next. So those are your three types. So a significant paper for John Hattie in the pandemic, which I read, was when he first published his visible learning, we had all these effect sizes in the league table and the whole teaching profession went crazy for it. What he realized was that they didn't differentiate different types of formative assessment by these three groups: feedback, feed up, feed forward. Whereas in his original research, he just grouped it all under the phrase feedback. So that was a eureka moment for me. So looking at it and kind of thinking about where I was when I first read that research, well, what if I take my own thinking a bit further? So being penalized by lots of work scrutinies, whether it's in my own school as a teacher or as a school leader leading work scrutinies, and never really getting a consistent result. Publishing the verbal feedback research with UCL back in 2019 was me trying to push the marking burden forward. Does everything really need to be written down? And how could we evidence a group of disadvantaged teachers working in really tough schools? How could they, where they traditionally have to mark once a week with a coloured pen, what if they didn't mark all year? What would it suggest? And this is what this report published. Again, a case study of 7 schools, 13 secondary school teachers, where they compared a class that they would normally mark books in, let's just say year 10 class, and another year 10 class where they didn't mark books all year. We tried lots of different techniques. We gathered the data 3 times a year, and the teachers reported back. And we found that the kids got the same or better exam scores, whether they had verbal feedback or not. So what I actually demonstrated was it was challenging that verbal feedback can make a difference to reduce the written burden. So taking it forward, I thought, well, let me break the marking dialogue into 3 ways, 3 techniques. I could feed back on your journey, written feedback, or we might say marking, or I can feed up on your grade. So this is when we might do a sticker or a stamp, and we, quickly stamp it in, circle the grade 5, and asterisks over the grade 9 if that's the target. And teachers do this all the time, but they might not use this phrase. The feed forward, again, when you write in a child's book, sometimes you'll leave 1 or 2 action points. You may explain it to them, you may say it to them, but again, here are 3 ways to mark books. Again, when I ask teachers, do they provide written verbal feedback? They all say, of course. I say, what's your technique? Can you teach it to me? Can I do it in 30 seconds with a child in class and get round as much as people in the classroom as I can? I think this is where scripts add lots of value, not to turn teachers into robots, but to make teachers' work and life a little bit easier, and for them to automate a methodology they can use in a range of scenarios. The feed up one's the same. What script would you use when you're talking to a student about a grade, whether it's a successful achievement or not? What technique would you use? And the same with feed forward. How do you explain to a student concisely in a small moment of time in a busy classroom? So again, there was 3 different ways I could speak to children. Then the non-verbal, well, if you work in an SEMH school setting or with mute students or visually impaired, you start to see the rich stuff that our teachers do. And it's fascinating. And then if you think what we do in typical schools, where we do in the thumbs up, the eyes on me, all those kind of gestures, what can I do that references the feedback, the journey, the grade, or the explanation? These do require a bit more thought. So the long story short was I grabbed 9 schools that I was already working with, all different very types of schools, all scattered across England. I thought, what if I get them to be a case study? Could they represent this one technique alongside the research I'm reading and produce a practical idea with a template that other teachers can try? And essentially it's promoting 9 different ways to mark books. But I try not to say the phrase marking or feedback anymore, because you can see on the screen there are 9 different ways to do some of these. So the phrase I'll use is formative assessment. And inside that includes all your other formative assessment methods, such as questioning. So in essence, the last slide, the feedback, making it simple, is how am I doing with my journey? That's a good way to sum up that methodology. The feed up is where am I going in terms of goal setting or objectives, the grades. The feed forward is what do I do next? And if you've got those 3 methodologies, think about your marking policy in your school now. Most school policies, if not all that I've read, feedback should be manageable, meaningful, and motivational, and sometimes timely, they might mention. And these terms are from the Education Endowment Foundation from 2006. The teaching world's moved on significantly in the last 20 years. So maybe it's time for us to have a richer approach to marking and feedback beyond that burden that still has teachers marking books on a Sunday night on their kitchen table instead of spending time with their families. So the last thing I'd share at the bottom here is I can do this written, as I've showed, or I can do it verbally, or maybe I can do it non-verbally. So hence the 9 different methods.
Couple of questions on that, just before we move on. Does it matter if one of those is missing, as in written, verbal, non-verbal?
No, what I'm trying to promote is I've identified 9 possibilities, 9 possible routes that you could provide marking and feedback assessment. It doesn't always have to be written feedback or written feed up or written feed forward. And when teachers do marking books, are they consciously differentiating between those 3 types, feedback, feed up, or feed forward? Or are we all just mushing it together? Probably, because we're trying to get through the marking headache. Now, undercurrent from the whole book is how do you quality sure? How do you gather evidence for all these 9 methods? So what I also want to do is to develop school leader confidence that you don't always need to go and look in Ross's or Tom's class sets of books to track evidence. Here are 6 other things you could possibly do, 6 other techniques. How would you check that when Tom gives verbal feedback to his students, how could you track that without Tom having to do verbal feedback stamps to belittle that process, that richness that he gives in classrooms?
2 questions here, and one relates to what you've just said from Nat on X, which I think is a valid sort of question here. So he said, the evidence for effective feedback should only really be the quality of the work. So work scrutiny is important, but not feedback scrutiny. That will annoy professionals. We should check the quality and depth of work all the time. Now, do you need to evidence feedback from an accountability point of view? Or can that be, okay, let's imagine me and you are in a school, okay, and the students do a test, right, in class or whatever. Could even be an actual exam, but let's imagine it's a low stakes quiz or a test of some sort, and they do, and the class perform particularly well on this. Yeah, a unit that you've just taught. Is that in itself quality assurance? That it's
well, this is the question. So when we define when we talk about evidence, we obviously need to define what it is we want to test. I guess when we think about some of the things we do in schools, obviously we can define how we might want to track student progress. I guess I'm challenging the norm that you don't always need to go into a child's book to see that progress being made, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
Going into kind of some definitions of evidence, typically, if we go and look at a child's book, or we want to, if we want to go down the verbal feedback route, we can talk about this one. We would typically evaluate the characteristic of the task. So let's say it's a poster or an essay. we know that's taking place, but we wouldn't necessarily evaluate the choice of task in our work scrutiny. So, think about a work scrutiny form. Typically, it might be, what's the date, what's the class, whose book are you looking at? And you might annotate, you might have a few tick boxes. I guess when we're thinking about the tick boxes, what is it that we're actually ticking? I'll show you one more slide, and then I'm going to try and not show you any more, because I know you said you wanted this to be a radio chat. There's another great piece of research from Professor Robert Coe, and he calls these influences. So if you go to number 8 here on the screen, timing, feedback should be timely. Let's say next Tuesday you've got a big exam, you give me an essay, and it looks like a grade 9, but I don't want to let you know that straight away, because you're going to get a bit assured of yourself and not put any more revision to secure that 9. So as a teacher, I'm going to delay the feedback until Friday or next Monday before your exam, because I know it will influence your behavior. That is, me as a teacher, my professional choice that will influence, I hope, your performance in the exam. Again, we go back to the evidence question. How do I evidence that the teacher has used that as a strategy, that it definitely adds value? There's lots of evidence in the world where things like these can be measured. I guess the challenge we have in our schools is we're so thinly stretched, we can't always measure some of these things on the screen. But if you think about, number one, the characteristic of the task, you'll look at the poster, you'll look at the assignment, but you won't necessarily document your evaluations of that, other than just looking at how the students responded. You'll then look at how the teacher responds to the student's piece of work, which is number 2. And that might be in a grade, the goal setting, or it might just be the teacher's left a couple of comments and how does it fit in with your marking policy and those kind of things. So there's lots in here, and I unpick them all in the book. And I guess I'm trying to just, the other undercurrent is trying to develop school leaders' wisdom with quality assurance beyond the traditional norms that we're all used to.
With
I don't know if that answers the question.
I don't know. Nat posed it. Nat, did that answer the question? Tweet us again. I was going to follow up with that with, so with quality assurance, are you talking about quality assuring the quality of the feedback that's being given, or are you talking about quality assuring whether it's working or not? Are they slightly different things?
They are different things, but
or both.
Yeah, they are. They're two different things, but I'm also talking about both. When we talk about providing student feedback, I can be the champion of marking in my school, but all feedback research is not what students know what to do next. It's them knowing how. So we get into metacognition here about teaching kids critical thinking, and everything that I read, research, publish myself, the more and more, the wiser I get. It's critical thinking skills that are the kind of golden chestnut to help our students unlock their learning. So maybe we should invest more time in that. Again, how do you do that with a 3-year-old or a 16-year-old in maths, PE, or English? That's what makes teaching very complex and interesting. The quality assurance for school leaders' point of view, but also what are we quality assuring is another question.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, we can touch back onto that maybe a bit later as well. I want to sort of dig in now. You've mentioned we know what those nine. I mean, to be honest with you, I'm going to call them chapters for the purpose of this conversation.
Yes, they are chapters, I suppose.
Yeah, because they're chapters in the book, so it's just easy to say chapters. So we say chapter 1 of the book. In fact, chapters 1, 2, and 3 are around written feedback. Okay, so sorry, Ross. Written feedback, written feed up, written feed forward.
Very good. You're learning.
There we go. I take great credit for that. But they're all the written form. Okay.
Yes.
So in chapter 1, we've got written feedback, and it talks about a strategy that I've come across before, and this is what I liked about the book, is you have got a practical idea in every chapter, which I really like. And because of your Wizzy tech skills, you've also got QR codes that take you to downloadable resources for each of the ideas. which I think is a real benefit of this book, okay? Especially for a new teacher or a newish teacher who wants to be able to access things.
Here it is. See it in practice.
Make a connection, okay? So, but in chapter 1, you've got written feedback and you've got the explainer. And by the way, again, just to explain to viewers, in the book, each chapter is split into 4 sections. You've got your explainer, you've got your practical idea, you've got your worked example, and you've got the template, which exists in the book as an actual template, but also as a QR code that you can download, right? And on chapter 1, when you've got this practical idea for written feedback specifically, and I can't, you'll have to remind me the case study score for that one. I can't remember. But
chapter 1, Joseph Cash Primary School in Coventry.
There you go. That was it. So the orange box, right? Now, I've seen this described as the purple box, the orange box, the yellow box. I've seen, but essentially, can you tell us or show us, whatever you would prefer, what this technique is and why? What I'm interested in is why you've chosen to include that as the idea in the chapter. Because I'm interested in every chapter why you've chosen a specific idea. Because there's a lot of ideas out there. There's tons of ideas out there.
There's 25,000 schools or something like that. There's only 9 in the book. What I wanted to do was provide one example of a type of school that might not be representative, but at least it's a type of. So primary, SEMH, further education, secondary, independent, all those kind of things. And I guess the other context is before the school is introduced in the practical idea, the context behind the school is also offered. So Joseph Cash is a large 3-form primary school in Coventry, serving very disadvantaged students, high levels of literacy, all those kind of things. So when we get into the orange box, it's an incarnation of my yellow box marking strategy that I promoted in Mark Plan Teach easily 10 plus years ago. It's not necessarily the color, because we can also get into colored pens and whether they add value and what the research says. There is lots of research on that as well.
Oh, I'd love to, Ross.
In terms of wanting students to take action, and if I can't write or hold a pen, then I need things sometimes made quite explicit. And if I'm working with a 3-year-old or an 11-year-old, all these ideas need translation. Like any idea, they can mutate into something ugly. They can be, through the quality assurance processes that we've just discussed, be used to beat teachers over the head with. In this school, that's quite the opposite. It's a technique of many techniques, but this is the one technique that fits in with the written feedback philosophy and the research from this school that I already have a relationship with. So that's one of many marking techniques they use, but it's one that they find works best to help students develop their literacy skills. Yeah. So when we're thinking about a typical student has written an assignment or a maths equation or whatever it might be, the premise behind the orange box is the teachers zone in on a misconception. They highlight that area with a redraft box, and they sometimes show students what to do next, or they encourage students to redraft in that specific space. I guess from a workload perspective, it's helping students focus in on one thing to try and fix. From a teacher's perspective, it's helping them as they flick through the books. If they are doing the traditional, red pen marking, they can see where they need to respond immediately as and when. All ideas have merit, all ideas. My favorite phrase is, there's many roads to Mecca. I can go down the M6, I can fly, I can take a boat. There's many ways to mark a child's book.
Yeah. So just to sort of summarize there, I mean, you explained it pretty succinctly, but you are essentially, as a teacher, drawing this, I guess it's like a rectangular, it's quite thin potential. I mean, you can vary the size of it, isn't it? Over a misconception that you want that student to address. And then what would they do with that then?
Well, it goes back to, it's not what they need to do, it's knowing how. And this is where I think this is one of the Achilles heels, not of the profession, just the nature of our profession with workload and things like that. We could spend all our life with one child helping them know how. But because we've got to get through, X number of pieces of assessment on a weekly basis, it is often teaching students how to respond, as well as knowing what to identify and what they should do next. So it's a tough one. the orange box is a technique in this context to showcase to some primary schools who might be in the same context where they've got highly disadvantaged kids. If they're looking for a genuine idea that reduces teacher workload and helps teachers focus in on as an area, but also students, how you interpretate it one step further. The book's there as here's an idea to take away.
Yeah, for sure. And I mean, I think it's quite nice. I've seen it done before. I've seen examples of it in sort of exercise books and stuff. And it's an interesting approach. I mean, the school in the actual sort of case study, they do talk about how it sort of works for them. Obviously, we're not going to read out the whole case study, but they do say that it's been a very successful strategy in their context. So. The next one, chapter 2, it talks about written feed up. Now, I want to get back. I want to go back to feed up, Ross. I want to keep feeding myself upwards.
Yes.
Now, in this particular chapter, we can talk about the idea that's in chapter 2 in a bit, but tell us, because there's an explainer in chapter 2 of written feed up. Now, I just want you again to explain
help you understand the word.
Yeah. Even though I do get it, actually, to be fair now, but it's taken me a bit to digest that and to think about the issues around it.
I guess another way to describe it is feed up is a timestamp of where you're at with your work, so a grade. But I'm also referencing your target. Now, you asked earlier whether the target's reliable. That's a different conversation. Yeah. But for definitions, I give you a timestamp today of your work. That's a grade 5. You're currently on a grade 6, whatever. But here, what you've produced is a 3 or a 9, and it's that reference to where you're at.
So with that, and I know you've got a sheet in the book of examples for these different things. So, for example, I think you've got one there that's got like all the different things that you could do with that. And I'm just wondering with that one, and this is a question that Chris actually asked a bit earlier, but I didn't managed to put it on screen in time. He said, is modeling necessary with feed up? I mean, for me, surely what you said is that is modeling.
All teaching techniques need modeling. Otherwise, you need to check.
But specifically with feed up, though, it is, isn't it? Because you're saying this is a level 3.
You have a thermometer on your board with a kind of timeline, or you have some grades on the board, a rubric or an A3 laminated sheet by your light switch telling kids what a grade A is and a grade C. So, if for answer the question, modeling the feed up, yes, there's your grades, here's your definitions, this is how it's going to be marked by me or by the exam board. That's you modeling feed up. Obviously, practically in the room, you're under your visualizer. Here's an assignment. Let me mark it. This is a grade X. You're modeling the feed up process again.
Got you. Do you think that teachers, I'm wondering, when you've sort of been going through the process of writing this, do you think that teachers don't do that enough? Is that an area like do you think that's
so don't do it? I think feed up is bread and butter for teachers. I think, we do it all the time. I guess we're not familiar with the language feed up. When I'm talking to kids about a grade, by definition, it's feed up. It's not feedback, it's feed up. So trying to push people's policies a bit further, trying to enrich the dialogue of marking and feedback, trying to celebrate all forms of marking, not just in your book. Feed up is that definition of what teachers do every day. Maybe it's a new way of thinking, but it's not. When I say it's nothing new, it's not anything new in terms of workload. It's just a new perspective on the dialogue of marking and feedback, which I think will enrich people pedagogically. How it influences school policies, that's my big challenge, is if we want to stop teachers leaving the profession, if we want to stop them marking books on a Sunday night on the kitchen table instead of spending time with the family, how do we have a richer approach to marking? Here are 9 possibilities. Could you get all 9 in the rhythm of your academic year, especially when you do quality assurance, rather than just always going at kids' books and looking at marking?
Chapter 3, still focusing on written feedback, talks about written feed forward. And the practical idea there is the KFC approach. Ross,
I like that one straight away. Yeah.
Can you tell us about the KFC approach? Is that just where you get? Is that where you get really depressed about all the marking you've got to do and go to KFC?
Oh yeah. There's a danger of the KFC, but the idea that the KFC stands for keep, flip, change, and essentially it's building in that kind of, whether you do it through a self or peer assessment methodology, it's kind of helping students, look at whatever piece of work they're doing and trying to build in, I guess, that critical thinking for them about, what's working, what's not, what would they change. So there's a few more ideas inside that are offered in terms of, maths, English, different subjects and things. And I've given people a few kind of worked examples of what it looks like, plus the template.
Well, can you just go into each one, keep, flip, change, just 2 sentences for each, what they are?
Of what? Of a technique? Yeah,
the technique itself. So what it actually looks like.
If you can forgive me, I'll read a quick example. So let's say we're in a textile class, and we're doing Year 6 textiles, and we're looking at fabrics and what have you. And I remind the kids that our preferred marking approach here is the KFC approach. I remind kids keep, flip, change. Let's say they're drawing some ideas for a T-shirt design. Me or someone else in the classroom is busy, drawing lots of different ideas, and they're kind of neither here or there, and they're not really meeting the assessment criteria. The teacher might then add in some prompts, such as, adding in some layers, annotating different fabrics, all those kind of things where we get into kind of subject terminology. The teacher might then see that the student has maybe not met the assessment criteria fully. So then when they get into the kind of approach, they're kind of getting, so the keep, flip, change, what would you currently keep that meets the criteria? What needs slight tweaks, so misconceptions and adjustments, and what needs to change because it doesn't meet the approach?
Got you.
So I believe this technique can be used verbally, but it also fits into the verbal. It's been placed into the written chapter because that's the case study chapter for the school in Birmingham. And again, this is a primary school. So interestingly, the first 3 case studies are all primary schools, which I found quite fascinating when we were talking about bringing the book together. And I guess, without going into greater detail, that KFC approach is getting kids to think critically about their decisions in line with assessment criteria. It could be delivered through a simple sticker. The methodology here is because it's placed in the feed forward section, written feed forward. What's provided in the book is a short template that the teachers can use as a sticker or a stamp or a methodology, where they can just put in the KFC acronym and then leave those 3 responses. So it's about explaining to students, again, what to do next. But the biggest headache with all feedback research is helping students know how to do it, which is the headache. Does that make sense?
No, it absolutely does.
I can tell kids what to do, but I need to invest more time in showing them how to do it.
The key, I think, because you do dig into this in the book, you talk about how, whether it's verbal feedback, written feedback, whatever, you do talk about how important the wording is. And I wondered with like thinking about this technique as an example, I think one of the most common challenges with giving feedback, and it's something I've done myself a million times probably, is giving feedback that is either not understood well enough or isn't. Like kids have come to me thinking, in the last couple of years even, and said, so if I do this, does this mean I get this? Right? I said, well, and literally my feedback could have been, can you expand this sentence? For example, something very specific, like, why don't you try expanding this paragraph and making it a bit more descriptive?
Yeah, I think what you're trying to say is, whatever the task, whatever the scenario and how it's responded, the most important thing is the feedback understood?
Yeah.
First of all, by the students, so whether they're 4 or 16. And I guess when we think about, that feedback provided, again, going back to, well, given the context, and then you've got all the motivational factors associated with it, am I inspired to go off and act on the feedback you've given me? So,
we're gonna get onto that in a minute. That you used that word inspire, and I was really interested in the book because we're going to move on to the verbal stuff now. Is the emphasis you place, and that actually leads on quite nicely into chapter 4, which is the first chapter that covers the verbal stuff, right? And in chapter 4, you talk. The example is this positive praise strategy. Now, I think off the top of my head, the case study was the Everton Free School in Liverpool. I could be wrong. It could have been 1. That's 5. Was it one in Durham? I can't remember. Sorry? Was it a school in Durham? I can't remember the school.
Chapter 4. God, you put me on the spot now. There's a school in Durham as well. That's chapter.
It doesn't
4.
matter. It doesn't matter. We're just talking about the technique. But in there, it was about sort of
positive language.
Positive language. Now, that one, I think that's quite a controversial. It's a little bit like the quality assurance stuff, because there will be those out there who would say, just give very factual sort of feedback. Give very, sort of, this is what you've done well. This is what you need to do better. And that's it, sort of thing. And then there'll be those who would say, right, if you give praise and you get it wrong in some way, then are you being positive about something that's not good enough?
Yeah, understood. Yeah, so I guess the first thing to highlight is this idea is provided by a alternative provision, an independent alternative provision with 60 students, all on the last chance saloon in the education system, all with significant SEN and mental health. So that's why that idea is put in there. Again, can I roll this out across my whole school in a secondary school with 2,000 kids? Debatable. So all ideas have merit. I guess you need to translate the ideas for context. It's who, when, where, why, all that kind of stuff that you need to consider.
And I think it was from that chapter, and that case study, where by using positive language, let's say, within and putting a real emphasis on that and a real focus on that, they'd seen examples where kids in that context had wanted to move to the front of class, for example.
Yeah, turn up to school. So, there's evidence. So when you think about these group of teachers, they work really hard on explicit verbal feedback strategies that are positively framed to manage students' emotions and behavior in that context. As a result of using explicit techniques time and time again, they've mapped it against attendance and engagement in class through questions, through responses, and through reward points. There is some evidence.
Yeah. I mean, is there anything on on chapter 4, verbal feedback? Is there anything on verbal feedback that you would say would be a don't do?
That's a good question, I suppose. You're putting me on the spot there.
I did tell you I would.
I think the most important thing is not to waffle. Last thing I want to do is provide you verbal feedback and go on for half an hour. So it needs to be clear and precise. It needs to be understood, and I need to know what to do next. All the research on feedback, again, I say this a lot, but it doesn't matter how well you could mark your books and all those kind of things, that students need to know what to do and how to do it. But, those are the kind of key things that we're trying to address. But the interesting thing about all feedback is regardless of the feedback method you provide, if you've not explained to students what to do next, they don't perceive they've received any feedback whatsoever.
Yeah.
So an example would be I just write some simple commentary in the book about how well you've done rather than what you should do next.
Yeah. Because I think, I was just going to say a general comment about verbal feedback is, and this is why I like the fact you've put a lot of emphasis on it in the book. I think that's great. And I also like the fact, referring to what you said at the very beginning, is that we don't necessarily spend enough time dissecting what these things actually look like on a very simple level. So, you've in the book, you've modeled conversations, for example, that can take place and put it in very explicit terms. Like, this is what it looks like. And I think sometimes that has been sort of neglected. People say, oh, verbal feedback. One thing I did want to ask you about verbal feedback before we move on to the next bit is, do you think that, so the research that's been carried out on verbal feedback, for example, is verbal feedback, does it correlate to the relationship that each student has with that given teacher? So what I'm saying is, if the student feels they have a good relationship with the teacher, and that teacher gives them verbal feedback, and then the next teacher they don't have as good a relationship with, they give them exactly the same verbal feedback, they use exactly the same prompts, they use exactly the same facial expressions, but they do not get what they want. Things do not move forward from that feedback.
No, my answer would be yes, but whether I can quote direct research immediately, I would have to, go off and find you some quotes that I've used. But, there's going to be lots of research about relationships in class and how students are motivated to respond simply because I've got a good relationship with you. If you define it as, do I like you or do I like your subject?
Yeah,
I need to define all those things. But these are all influences. I showed on the screen earlier the kind of 16 characteristics. Motivation is in there, and that's going to also be derived from, do I like being in your lesson, miss?
Yeah, absolutely. But that's interesting. What I'm sort of getting at here in a bigger picture thing is, sort of, it's almost like saying that feedback, the quality of feedback is almost like, I'm picking numbers out of the air here, but like doubled in value, trebled in value, quadrupled in value, depending on the relationship the teacher has with the students, especially when it comes to verbal feedback. Because, I'm just plucking ideas here out of
I mean, I would have no doubt that, a good relationship enables children to succeed. So whether we're talking about feedback or something else, I suspect, lots of academic successful outcomes will be a result of, I enjoy being in this lesson. The teacher motivates me to work in lesson and out of lesson when they're not around. And as a result, it impacts on my outcomes. I'm confident there's lots of research to suggest that's the case.
Definitely. Okay. So verbal feed forward. So again, it's this idea that we touched on earlier on, or in fact, you've got feed up first. So feed up, you talked about this idea of prompting up. Can you tell us a bit about that? The practical idea in that section?
So I guess the prompting up is like a kind of nudging up. So if you think about, the up again is that timestamp of where you're at in the grade. Here's your target grade. So it's that kind of prompting up to the next stage. So it might be not necessarily an entire grade. It might be a little kind of sub-level of grade within the grade, a strong C or a weak C, that kind of dialogue. And just inside you'd be given another script. I guess a lot of, not the criticism of the book, but a lot of critique about verbal feedback is, should it be evidence? I firmly believe it is. It should. How do you do it well without it penalising teachers and falling into this trap of, how do I track that I've talked to all my kids?
You know what, Ross? Let's create a clip for the show. I disagree with you. I don't think verbal feedback needs to be evidence. I'll explain why, because I'm interested in your rationale.
Evidence in it, first of all.
Well, no, but I want to get into your rationale for why, right? So,
I'll give you my rationale very quickly. Okay. Let's say I've got a great script that I use time and time again that helps students, whether it's referencing the grade, the feed up, the feedback, their journey, the motivation, or the forward, what to do next. Let's say I've got a great script and I'm using this time and time again, and it clearly is motivating my students. If I want to evidence that, there are many ways that I could evidence that, not in books, not through silly stamps, but I might demonstrate that as a result of my techniques, more students are completing work, and as a result, I'm offering a lot more reward points in my class on Sims than I ever did before. One example. Another example might be that my students are submitting more homeworks than they've ever done before as a result of me providing verbal feedback back in class rather than AI-generated marking or kind of like that automated assessment that might happen online. Another way to demonstrate that would be students arrive to class on time and the punctuality is improved. Lots of schools, sometimes face punctuality issues too. So that might be another source of evidence. So when we come to outcomes, we have to define outcomes. It can't always be an exam grade. And when we think about all the things that we do in our schools, punctuality, behavior exclusions, engagement, admissions to Key Stage 4, admissions to the school, parental involvement, what have you, homework, there are many ways we can evaluate success when it comes to outcomes. So what I also try and do in the book, I know you've got the book to hand on your screen, Tom. I'll dig out the page shortly. But what I do in all the books is, all the chapters of the book is I show you how each of the schools have provided evidence beyond exam scores of the technique they use, how it can be quality assured if you want to provide, again, that richer methodology that we need to move away from the notion that we can only check kids' progress in a book.
Okay. But why do we? I'm still on that. So why do we need to evidence verbal feedback? Yeah. So my rationale would be that.
So are you of the same view that we should evidence written feedback?
No.
Should we look in kids' books?
Depends what for. Depends what for and with what methodology. Because to see what students have been doing, possibly.
Yeah.
But
so let's think about all our subjects we might offer at secondary school. So your arts, your PEs, your dramas, those subjects where they don't typically have a heavy evidence base in books.
Yeah.
So you think about a drama teacher, for example, the amount of dialogue, rich terminology.
I'd just ask them.
Students. What would you ask?
What have you been doing with the kids?
You'd ask the kids this. Okay.
No, I'd ask the teacher.
Okay.
What have you been doing this time?
No, but if we're getting into robust accountability, quality assurance, academic studies, academic research about what works, we need to be a bit more rigorous than just asking kids random questions.
But it depends what you're going to get out of those rigorous questions. What evidence can you?
Of course. So again, with all of these things, they need defined. What would be the purpose of evaluating verbal feedback? Who are we evaluating? 4-year-olds or 15-year-olds? What subject? Why are we trying to evaluate verbal feedback? These are some of the healthy questions we should be asking.
Yeah. I mean, as I said, my rationale is just why. Because
more than anything, we want to know what works, don't we? If I can show you that I can do a script in 30 seconds that provides verbal feedback up or forward and it works, how do I evidence that?
But by evidencing that, I'm taking time.
Maybe evidence is a word you're not comfortable with, because all of us in our teaching profession, we've been scarred by it. So another headache is all of us have been at the foul play of work scrutiny because it's evidenced through kids' data and through work scrutinies that are often conducted poorly. So that word evidence, maybe we come up with another word. What we're trying to do is evaluate its reliability and success.
Yeah.
Because teachers spend every second of their working day providing rich conversations to their students. How can we demonstrate that they add value? And how do we also identify which ones add value more than me just waffling? So that's what I'd love to get into the business of, is
some things though you can't quantify, and what you cannot quantify. Okay, I'll give you an example. Mr. Rogers. We had a chat the other day about an essay I'd written. Yes. And he made a really funny joke in the conversation we had about the essay I'd written. It was something about Blackadder and ostriches and 1914. But also he talked about this and this, right? It's very difficult to evaluate or evidence those sort of conversations. It is. Are we then? By the way, we're not going to spend like another hour on this.
Yeah, but I would probably say
I do think it's an interesting one. I think it's a really interesting one. Whether you can quantify, whether you should try and quantify. I get what you're saying about wanting to know what works, and I get that. And actually, I think there's a real value in the things in your book around sort of modeling the conversations and actually getting into the real sort of simple details of what happens. I get that, and that's something I agree with. The bit I'm sort of not as sure on is that idea of how we evaluate that, evidence that, or whether we should.
Yeah, well, as anything, it needs defined.
Yeah. So
the more defined it is, the more reliable our methods can be to evaluate the data that comes back.
True, but then also there are some good methodologies. So scripts, right, for verbal feedback, which you've included. But maybe like a teacher will get an amazing. Like, I give an example. Like, I know this is. I don't even know if this is right or wrong. But let's imagine a teacher, because someone did it to me. They did it to me. Okay, when I was in school, they said you're going to get an E at English literature.
Right, and did you?
No, I got a B.
Right, there you go.
Somehow.
So, did the feedback work, or did that feedback stick?
The feedback worked, but it was false. The feedback worked, but it was false. It was like I was fuming about it, but because I was fuming about it, I worked harder and did better. But the feedback was wrong. The feedback itself was wrong.
No, it wasn't that moment, but it's hard to evaluate this one episode. But you might have had, maybe that's the only bit of feedback you chose to remember because it was probably the one that was most hurtful.
Possibly.
So there's a lot of emotional permutations with that one also. But who's to know that your teacher did a lot of other brilliant stuff going on that also motivate you to get that grade B?
It's fair.
We don't know.
We don't know. Right. I want to move on because I want to try and get through a few more. So we'll leave verbal feedback, feeding up and feed forward. We'll leave verbal, right? Let's move on to the last sections, which are on non-verbal feedback. Now, this to me was the most interesting part.
Yes.
Okay. Because
was for me too.
Yeah. So I wondered, for you, when you put it together, those sections, when you'd finish them, writing them, did you think? What did you think? Did you think this is new, or this is?
No, I thought a teacher's most powerful asset is their voice. And we take it for granted. And actually, this was first highlighted to me by a music teacher I worked with 15 years ago, that he wanted, when I was in charge of CPD, he wanted voice training to be part of the CPD program. And I looked at him funny, like, what are you on about? But probably a couple of months later, I lost my voice like you do through the winter period. And then it made me realize, and I definitely wrote a blog about it through that conversation with a colleague, that actually your voice is a teacher's most important asset. However, when you're working in a wide range of SEMH settings, or you see teachers on your travels that are working with children that are mute, visually impaired and what have you, and you get into the kind of details of British Sign Language, and then it starts to highlight all the gestures that we give in class that really add value and motivation and make kids behave, and all those kind of things. Even our behavior conversations, our non-verbal signals we go down the corridor when we're, all these things are very rich, but how do we shine a light on them as techniques that we could use consciously in our classroom, where maybe all teachers could develop 3 or 4, I call them jazz hands techniques. How do you develop certain techniques that you use time and time again that get students to respond in the moment, which is your feedback? So then again, fitting it into the entire book, here are 3 different types of schools. Here's the technique they use because of their context, and here's how it links to outcomes. And not often, because it's non-verbal, you can't see it in a book. So again, I found it, for me, I've been in education 30 years. This was a whole new way of looking and thinking for me. And I thought it was fascinating. A lot of teachers that work in our brilliant special schools, this will be old news to them, some of it. So I wanted to provide a whistle-stop tour of all these different techniques to shine a light on each of them, that they all have merit. And if you wanted to, as a school leader, could you introduce these 9 into your marking techniques if they were applicable? primary teachers aren't going to use some of the secondary methods and vice versa and so on and so forth. But it's demonstrating also 9 different ways to source evidence. And again, I know we have a problem with that word, but it's also moving beyond the traditional form that we always have to go into a child's book and see how they've done. So there's tons of stuff in there, I suppose, where, you've got the basics like nodding and thumbs up, but you really get into very detailed language. In fact, if you've got the book to hand, Tom, maybe page 91, you've got things like haptics and kinesics, proxemics and proximity.
Yes.
Things like that. And then if you pop over to, there's another page where on page 79, you've got loads of kind of the obvious things that we do, such as smiling, pointing, waving hands. These are basic things that we take for granted. But there's somewhere else in there, if I just find the page in a second, where you really get into the kind of specialist terms that people use for these kind of methods.
Yeah. I mean, I'm just looking at the case study.
On page 892, sorry to interrupt.
Yeah, no problem.
So you've got all these kind of non-verbal components, paralanguage, appearance, posture, things like that.
Yeah, it was really interesting to see it broken down and to see how many things I guess we take for granted. Certainly I do, from reading the lists that I sort of already do, but it's nice to see it there. And I think just to give it a bit more importance on paper, is quite a good thing.
Yeah, my simple way of describing non-verbal feedback, feed up, feed forward would be this. Yeah. I'm in a kind of test condition exam hall. It's not a final summer exam, but it's maybe just a kind of a mock exam, so it's not so high pressure. I walk past a child who's a bit, you can see they're not concentrating, they're a bit distracted. I catch their eye and I do the hand wobble, are you okay? And then I might do the eyes, and then maybe they're in a classroom doing their SATs or whatever. And let's just say there's a lovely shiny display with the model answers on the board. I could do that, or I could look at their work and do a hand wobble, thumb down, not, and the grumpy frown. That's a bit of a non-verbal feedback gesture immediately. But the feed forward, eyes on me, look at the display, that's a feed forward gesture. So again, how do I do that more explicitly, routinely as a strategy? How can I teach my students to respond to these gestures? And again, the bigger question, how would I evidence these? Because you think of all the brilliant stuff our teachers do that are not seen. Now, the question again, do you want to evidence these things? Well, here lies the debate. Rather than me try to belittle the teaching process, well, how many thumbs up did Tom give his kids in class today? Or how many gestures did he lean in? That's where we start to belittle accountability and make the working lives of teachers poorer and harder to achieve. So you'll know from me, I'm not promoting those things at all.
No, for sure. Yeah. And I'm just looking at the list, and it's interesting, you've got appearance on there as well as a strategy, which is interesting, dressing professionally for the relevant role to set an example.
Well, PE teacher, science teacher, drama teacher, swimming teacher.
Yeah, I agree with that. You've got artifacts using visual aids like flashcards, body language. You've got, that was a new word I hadn't come across, chronemics.
So this is,
anyone out there that's using
timing.
Yeah. So timers on whiteboards, eye contact, facial expressions, gestures, haptics, which is handshakes or whatever.
Well, haptics, a good way to describe haptic touch. If you think about your mobile phones, we've got that screen and you feel it click underneath the surface. That's haptic touch.
Yeah, we've got kinesics, oculesics, which is maintaining eye contact.
Some of this will be quite high level for people, but when you read it, I've tried to simplify it. These are things that we do really consciously that we don't take for granted.
That's really
good.
That we
do take for granted, I should say.
And then the last one on there is posture. Standing straight to show confidence, slouching, folding arms. Yeah, so posture. Yeah, I mean, great. How important do you think the non-verbal stuff is in comparison to the two, or do you just see it as another tool?
I'll give you an example. I can quickly run in my room
Your camera's amazing. Let's all just amaze at the camera that zooms in on things.
Right. So I'm in a maths lesson. You know, I'll say what I said at the start. Not everyone's going to be ready for this. You know, all the ideas in the book. It's definitely a new way of looking at the dialogue of marking, I suppose. So think about non-verbal gestures. I've got an equation. I don't know if my camera's going to pick up.
Yeah.
Be a bit blurred, but 7 times something equals 28. So version 1 in my classroom, I'm just going like this on the big whiteboard at the front. 7 times something equals 28. But when I add in a non-verbal gesture, if I can get it a bit more in focus, I'd do it this way. Try and get it in. Sorry about the focus.
We can see it.
7 times something equals 28. So I've given you a non-verbal signal there. So obviously I've not made it very explicit, but at least there's another bit of data that helps my students process, which aids their cognition. So if I did version 1 again, 7 times something equals 28. It's a busy nature of the classroom. I haven't really thought about how best to deliver this equation. I just explain it straight away. But if I do it another way with the non-verbal signal, so we've got the non-verbal signal here, 7 times something equals 28. So you got the tap, tap. So that's telling my students, not quite explicitly, but it's signaling to them through a non-verbal gesture, this is what we're trying to work out. But to add even more data, I can look straight at my students in the eye, 7 times something, you see my lips. Primary teachers are brilliant at this, and so are early years, 7 times something, they really accentuate their mouth. And then there's 3 bits of data I've added immediately to this non-verbal signal. So already in terms of pedagogy, yes, the answer's 4, but what I'm also trying to do is help students process the information. So it's another way of looking at the things that we do every day in our classrooms where we can add a bit more rich data through simple gestures.
Got you. Right, moving towards, so obviously, explore more in the book, people. We're only touching on sort of some of this due to how much time we have. We'd need a full day really to explore it that fully. However, we're moving towards, so we've covered nonverbal, and we're moving towards the final part of the book where you offer sort of, well, you've called it in the actual chapter list. You've said, I think, what have you said at the very end? You've called it, I don't know, I can't find the contents page now, but
bring it all together.
What next?
What next?
What next? So what is next? You've put a formative assessment identification grid on there. So what is next, Ross?
Right. So I'm going to show you one more
when
screen.
You've covered all of this.
Okay. So the first thing I'd get all our teachers to do is if I share that.
Yeah.
There. So in your current teaching and learning marking methods, whether you just want to mark books, then you've got your top row, but could you come up with 3 different techniques that enrich your marking further? So top left, box number 1, which marking techniques are only feeding back on the journey, or are you still mulching it all into one technique all of the time? When you do your stickers and stamps and you give kids grades, that's row 1, box 2, that's your feed up. When you're explicitly explaining to students what to do next in written format, that's your box 3. So as a CPD activity, I'd say to teachers, could you give me 3 different techniques? Let's enrich our pedagogy. Let's try and come up with 3 different marking methodologies. All teachers provide verbal feedback. I'll say, well, what's your script? What's it called? Could you teach it to me? It can't just be a chat. It's got to be we're teachers, we're professionals. We need a methodology we can use time and time again. So whatever that's called, whatever routine that you use, it needs to go into box 4. If you're now talking to kids in verbal feedback moments, referencing their grades, how do you do that in 30 seconds or in 5 minutes? What's it called, and can you teach it to me so I can use it with my kids? And of course, these will need translating for year 1s, year 11s, etc. And then box 6, what are you doing to explain? How do you do that succinctly so kids know that when you've written or spoken to them, they know what to do next and how? So how could you do that in a nice, succinct fashion time and time again with 30 students every lesson of the week, all year? And it reduces workload over time. And then the bottom 3, they're the tricky ones. So that's the thumbs up, thumbs down, and looking at the whiteboard displays and things like that. So you ask your specialist teachers here on the bottom row, they'll fill that one box up really easy. So in the slides, without going through, I'll just give some examples and things like that. And I guess some of the methods I would do as part of the training is let's work out some techniques that are a waste of time, too much workload on your part, kids don't respond. How do we get more of these techniques in the green zone where students are responding? And in the QR codes that you can see in the book, some of the resources that I give people. So the first one is this one, where let's think about your children now as novices or experts in your subject or specific task. If I want to give them feedback, that's that left column, but are they a novice, struggling, or are they an expert? Could I differentiate the feedback I provide? So what I give is loads of examples of feedback, feed up or feed forward based on level of expertise. And then the other resource I give is, this is by format. So these columns are by written, verbal, or non-verbal. And again, here's some examples based on if they're a novice or an expert. How I'd see this form going one step further is, let's take the top left box, so I'm a novice, and the teacher's providing written feedback. I could divide that box further by verbal, written, or non-verbal. By feedback, feed up, feed forward, I should say. So I guess the strategic plan is a whole school strategy. Think about your summative calendar. If I wanted to celebrate a rich variety of marking strategies, here are your 9 techniques across the top row that synchronize with your summative data collection, different points and rhythms of the academic year. So as an example, in September, I'm getting to know my kids, how well they're doing. I'm going to speak to them. This is my verbal script, and I'm feeding forward about what they do next. Of course, sometimes I'll be stamping and ticking and flicking as part of other marking strategies, but this is my department, year team, or whole school approach to balance that quality assurance headache. In October, half a term has gone. I've now got enough work to feed back on their journey, but I'm going to write it in their books. So rather than me always having to write in the books all of the time, maybe it might be a priority across the school in October only. So it's balancing workload. It's celebrating 9 different methods. This is just my example. So primary school would have an entirely different grid as would a secondary school. They may not have all 9. They may just choose 1 or 2. But it's kind of hopefully celebrating 9 different ways to mark.
Got you. I think that's a wonderful place to sort of end. I want to sort of just throw the book up again. This is what we've been talking about for the last nearly 90 minutes, is the Teacher Toolkit Guide to Feedback, which is available through Bloomsbury. You can get that on their website. Just head over there and yeah, get it. But I wondered, just finally, Ross, as a final sort of thought, if you were to say if you had the chance to only say one thing to a school leader, a new school leader, on feedback, and you only had a chance to say one thing, what would that one thing be?
As a phrase, it's outdated because I've highlighted that there's feed up and feed forward, and they've been around academically for 30 years. So is it time now to enrich our practice and support more teachers in the profession?
Perfect. Listen, thank you ever so much. Certainly I've learned a lot, and I'm sure our viewers have as well. This will be available as a podcast as well, if people prefer just to listen. And obviously, if you want to watch back, if you've just joined towards the end and you want to watch back, it's on YouTube, it's on X, it's on Facebook, LinkedIn. And yeah, so if you want to watch back, that's where you can go. If you want to listen back, it will be on the podcast. Ross, thank you very much for joining me.
Pleasure.
I'm sure we will check in again. And I hope everybody out there has a wonderful rest of the week. And yeah, take care. See you later.
Thanks, everybody. Bye-bye.
You've been listening to Teachers Talk Radio. Tune in live and listen back at ttradio.org. We look forward to hearing from you next time on Teachers Talk Radio.